I'm a fraudster, and I'm going to scare the living daylights out of more than 1 in 5 of you. Your online password is...
Adding numbers, capitals and symbols makes your password stronger.
Radio.
The Independent Republic of Mike Graham on TalkRADIO.
Let us, without further ado, say a very good morning to Mr. Peter Hitchens. Peter, how are you?
Good morning. So far, so good, thank you.
So far, so good. Well, you say that, but I came in quite irritable this morning. I'm feeling slightly less irritable because I've had an hour of venting my spleen, so I'm feeling slightly better. But it's all rather depressing, isn't it?
Well, you could make it that way. I mean, depression is irrational grief without any cause for it. I think that I accepted some time ago that the people of most formerly free countries had decided that they were going to agree to move into this new era in which they grant far greater powers than ever before to their governments over their lives in return for what they believe to be safety. There is no limit to this, as we see. As you rightly point out, there's extremely thin evidence. There's nothing to be worried about this variant. And if you remember, I think we first discussed the likely appearance of new variants when we were having this discussion with each other more than a year ago.
Yeah.
I said there will keep being new variants whenever the thing slackens off. This will be, because the thing about them is that they immediately increase the amount of unknowing. People think, oh, a new variant, we don't know anything about that, we have to take precautions. Now, I've got nothing against the attempts to restrict travel from the countries where this variant is, in case it turns out to be serious. That's a reasonable thing to do. I might personally think it an overreaction, but I'm not going to argue very hard against it.
Except like all of these clampdowns, it came after loads of people had arrived from South Africa who weren't actually tested before they came into the country.
Of course. So much of this is symbolic flailing about. Most notable of all, of course, the renewed decision to tell us what's where. I'm constantly amazed to be living in a country where the government tells people what's where and they obey. And for a long time, when people say, we must make laws banning Muslim women from wearing face veils, and you can't do that.
Right.
Serious free countries cannot go around telling people what not to wear and what to wear, except basically covering their nakedness for purposes of decency, which is a different thing. But you can't go around saying what kind of garments. It always seems to me to be an amazing declaration of superior knowledge and understanding that we seem to have discovered that the human body, which has functioned reasonably well over many millennia, is inadequate. And we've decided to adapt it, so we can't actually show our faces anymore in public. It's extraordinary.
But except only in certain places. I mean, you're all right to show them in a pub or
you be careful what you say.
In a restaurant.
If you start saying things like that, then they will start demanding it in pubs. They'll never say, oh, the logic's ridiculous, we'll stop making people wear them on trains. Say, okay, you're right. It is absurd that we enforce them on trains and don't enforce them in pubs. Let's have them in pubs. Let's have them in public lavatories. Let's have them everywhere you care to name. In bed. Don't try that argument. It will never ever work. It will always lead to worse things.
No, I'm sure that's true. But the difficult part about all of this, though, is you get the sense from that press conference, I don't know if you were able to watch it on Saturday, that it's all a bit of sort of theatre. It's all a bit of show. It's all a bit of, well, we better look as if we're doing something. Because if we don't do anything, there'll be scientists telling us that we should have done more.
The politics is theatre, as indeed is law enforcement and so many other things. We pretend that we have far more control over events than we do have. And also what we see in these events is a Prime Minister who has a reasonable amount of political power, which he derives directly from the population, because unlike most modern leaders, he has a direct relationship, thanks to his television stardom, with millions of people, which gives him a power that his rivals don't have. But on the other hand, there are other people around him who have power. Say, oh, well, Prime Minister, if this goes wrong, if the hospitals are overwhelmed again in January and February because you didn't take this decision, then you'll be the one in trouble. And of course, he's afraid of that. And you can see, I think, fairly clearly that the medical power structure was once again bossing the actual constitutional government around. And here we have it. And they will always give way to this because of the fear that it might just turn out this time to be right. The problem with it all is that none of it works. I keep on saying this. It's all available to anybody. You don't need any particular brilliance to see it. The case of Sweden demonstrates beyond doubt that not doing all this stuff doesn't lead to outcomes significantly worse than doing it. And there is a thing called the Stringency Index, which was put together, I think, by Oxford University, in which they rank the stringency of shutdowns by all nations. And you set this beside the deaths per million, and you will find no congruence at all. It doesn't actually have a bearing on the outcome. And yet we continue to behave as if the case for shutting down society is proven that it will work. And even if it in short terms, I imagine if you have a Chinese type system where you actually weld people into their homes and possibly strap them to their beds and tell them not to move, you might prevent the transmission of disease for a little while, but it will only postpone it. Because
but I mean, we saw even in New Zealand, right?
Even work.
But even in New Zealand and Australia, where people were literally not allowed to go anywhere for weeks on end, even that didn't result in zero COVID, because there is no such thing as zero COVID. And with regard to the mask wearing, in places like Scotland, where they've been wearing them for a lot longer than we have, it doesn't appear to have made any difference. If anything, it's made it worse. Same in Germany, same in France, same in Spain, all of the places which are now suffering. Same in Austria, it doesn't appear that any of these measures have actually helped them.
Well, this is the problem. And of course, we also now get word from South Africa that those cases of the oh my gosh variant, which have actually come to the point of the patient developing symptoms, there has not so far, and let us hope this remains the case, has not so far been any sign that it's particularly serious. In fact, less so with people not suffering that rather unpleasant symptom of COVID, of losing their senses of taste and smell. So I don't. But I just think this is a constant. This link has been made in the minds of humanity between staying safe and taking this sort of measure. There are, in my view, much more intelligent, much more proportionate measures which a civilized society could take to keep this disease under control. And also, it could revise quite seriously its methods of measuring its prevalence. I think we are very lax in the ways in which we record its prevalence and describe its scourge, because we've set our measures in ways which make things seem very much worse than I suspect they are. But I only say this because it's a duty. To say it, because it's true and I believe it to be true. I know that the argument has been lost. Most people prefer safety to reason, and they think they're safer if they follow these arguments. And I will doubtless be excoriated for saying things that I'm saying and accused of saying things that I haven't said as a result of having done it.
But it's very similar, isn't it? It's very similar to the climate change polls that get done, and people get asked, would you like to save the planet? They're not going to say no, in the same way that if you say, would you like to stay safe, therefore would you wear a mask? They're going to say yes. But the fact is, though, that I think the change in sort of attitude in the country now compared to, say, this time last year, when November was shut down, if you remember, I think it's quite stark.
Well, it is, and you see interesting things like Dominic Lawson, who was very much in favour of the first lockdown, being sceptical about the zero COVID merchants in the Daily Mail today, which is an interesting development. I wish there was more of it, because Dominic is an intelligent person, and I missed his voice at the beginning of this. But the problem is, it's too late. We have, in fact, undergone a revolution in Western societies, in which we have handed over a great deal more power to our rulers than they ever had before, or than they ought to have. And once you've handed over power, I'm terribly sorry to tell you, you won't get it back. And if it wasn't this, I'm terribly afraid to tell you, it would be something else.
Well, that's slightly worrying, isn't it? Because here we are supposedly, I mean, until I would say, a week ago, we were thinking, I think along the lines that most people were of the opinion that we were sort of getting out of it. Yes, it was terrible in Europe, and Austria was locking down, and the Netherlands were shooting people, and back here in Germany it was all getting locked down again. But we were actually doing all right, and suddenly now this comes along at the weekend. And it was all very kind. I mean, like, for example, the other thing that astonishes me is this introduction once again of different testing regimes for when you're away on a foreign trip, so that when you come back, you have to supposedly self-isolate until you've had a test. But don't worry, you can mix with loads of people on a plane, in the arrivals hall, in a tube before you get home. So therefore, if you have got anything wrong with you, you'll have already spread it before you stay home for 2 days.
Yeah, 2 points from that. One, I have the people who must have absolutely rejoiced over this are those pop-up companies which will poke a thing up your nose for 150 quid.
Yeah.
Who I think were suffering a slight diminution of business up till now. They're very much back in business. The other thing is, honestly, Mike, were you surprised when this happened?
Well, I was a bit, actually. A bit. Because, you know...
You should pay more attention to what I tell you.
I realise that. I do realise that. But I genuinely... No, but I was genuinely optimistic that actually... The Downing Street regime, such as it is, had reached the point of no return. They'd worked out that actually we now have to try and figure out how to govern the country without COVID. We have to try and figure out some policies that people will actually like us to do, and which will become user-friendly. And they'd obviously not done that for such a long time that all the policies they introduced were useless and hopeless and everybody hated them. So maybe they decided just to go back to COVID because that's where they feel most comfortable.
Well, optimism is a snare and a delusion. It'll only make you unhappy, and I do warn people against it all the time, but they will not pay attention. I have a feeling if it hadn't been this, we might have been engaged in a much more profound scare about the alleged preparations that Russia is supposedly making to invade Ukraine, which does some sort of war, either involving Iran or Russia, or possibly both of them, does seem to me to be the next major reason for a serious increase, say, in government power, and a serious increase in conformity and in unanimity in public opinion, as we move towards the strong state in every direction. There's always going to be something, and people are always going to believe it, partly because we have so totally trashed our education system that the old minimal number of maybe 1 million people who were properly educated and could think and didn't take everything for granted have been more or less abolished. And even the universities are now full of conformists.
They really are. And in fact, worse than that, they want us to conform to their way of thinking rather than actually having a conversation.
That's right.
about what might be worth talking about. But I mean, I just think that my optimism has not even now been dented, because I'm still thinking to myself, in 3 weeks' time, they're going to take all this off and they're going to go, actually, it turned out not to be something to worry about after all. Because otherwise, if they're going to, I mean, there are, as you know, and as you've said many times, there are new variants appearing literally every sort of couple of nanoseconds. You know, there's loads of them. There are hundreds of them every single week. But we only concentrate on occasional variants, which apparently catch our eye. And as I say, from South Africa's point of view, this particular one, as far as they say, isn't very troublesome.
Well, so we are told. I wonder actually if I shouldn't set up, instead of attempting in this hopeless, futile way to influence public opinion towards rationality, if I shouldn't set up in Harley Street as a pessimism therapist, offering people happiness through pessimism.
Well, listen, I'll tell you what, you've certainly cheered me up, Peter, because I was pretty grumpy when I started doing this show, but you've at least brought a smile to my face. But stay where you are for a moment, because we're just going to take a little break and we'll come back to Peter. He's got some other things to talk about as well. He wants to say something, I'm sure, about what he wrote in his column this week about marijuana, once again. This is, of course, Talk Radio. We're going to take some calls. We have got loads of them to take. We will get to them. 0344 499 1000. This is Talk Radio.
Online, on DAB+, and on the
Talk Radio.
Welcome back to the Independent Republic of Mike Graham, right here on Talk Radio. We're talking to Peter Hitchens with the Mail on Sunday, of course. Wrote a very interesting column this week. We've spoken about the mask situation. He's cheered me up quite dramatically, which is good, because it's never good to be angry when you're doing a radio show, although I was quite enjoying it in the first hour. Let's talk now, though, about marijuana, because, Peter, you've always said that this is a much more dangerous drug than anyone will ever say that it is, particularly nowadays. You know, it's in common usage on the streets, it's in common usage on television. Everybody seems to be smoking marijuana these days. You maintain that it's a psychotic drug which could make people behave in a way which is quite unconscionable and something that they wouldn't do otherwise without the influence of it. Tell us about what you wrote this weekend.
Well, it's this extraordinary story from Wisconsin. Now, every time there is a rampage killing on either side of the Atlantic, or indeed as far away as Japan, I always wait for the news that the killer will turn out to have been a marijuana user. Sometimes it's steroids and marijuana, but in a huge number of cases of these killings, the person turns out to be a marijuana user. Now, what people do is they respond idiotically to this and say, are you saying that there is no such thing as Islamic terrorism, or are you saying there's nothing to worry about with gun control in the US? Because there are two very big lobbies, the gun control lobby in the US, which takes any killing in the United States as being evidence of the need to get guns under control, and what you might call the alarmist lobby in this country, which wants to tell us that Islamic terrorism is a huge threat to our society. Both of these groups are offended by my saying this because they think I'm trying to undermine them. Well, I don't actually care whether I undermine them or not. What I'm much more concerned about is whether what we see here, and it's not actually about terrorism or rampage killings. The point is, you'll know this as a newspaper person, that very few crimes are actually properly covered these days. Crime has grown so much, particularly violent crime, in our society, particularly in recent years, that crimes which would once have made the front pages of national newspapers now barely make it to page 94 of local newspapers. For so many, they don't get examined. The point about these rampage killings is they do get examined, and it turns out that people who've committed crimes of crazy violence, and it is some crimes are rational. People are trying to gain something from them. These crimes have no purpose at all, like the man last week who was convicted of manslaughter after stabbing his girlfriend and then running her over with his car. And what was the point of that for anybody? What gain could anybody? It was plainly the act of somebody who was out of his mind. And the thing about these high-profile crimes is that they are a closely studied subset of crime in general. If we studied, as we should, all violent crime, and as I recommend, my guess is that you would find that the influence of marijuana in such crime is very high indeed. Indeed, there is a very fascinating website called Attacker Smoked Cannabis, which anybody can search, in which a very clever person has set up now a total registry of all the local newspaper coverage of crimes in which marijuana is an element, and these are, say, these mad, irrational acts of violence, sometimes leading to death, sometimes just a terrible injury, sometimes just to misery. There is so much of it about. And actually, last week was a very bad week for what I call the cause of big dope, which I equate with big tobacco, the nasty greed lobby, which doesn't care about human misery and prefers to make money. The two are so similar. Back in the 50s and 60s, big tobacco used to say, oh, no, nothing to worry about with cigarettes, no real harm at all, this is all state bossiness, telling people what to do, we shouldn't do anything about it, bans on advertising, bans on sale, let's have that. Exactly the same arguments now being advanced by the almost equally rich billionaire lobby which seeks to get marijuana on open sale and advertised on TV and available freely on the internet. They see huge riches in this, and large numbers of politicians see a huge tax opportunity too. So this lobby had a very bad week because in the Times, a newspaper of the soppy left, the columnist Claire Foges wrote an article which more or less I could have written on this subject, pointing out all these things, a huge breakthrough. And one of the first responses to it was a letter to that paper from Professor Sir Robin Murray, one of the most distinguished psychiatrists in the country, who virtually, I will only ever say there's a correlation between marijuana use and mental illness. He pretty much accepts that the relation is there and might as well be understood to be causal. And he's greatly hardened his position on it over the past few years because of the huge experience he has practicing as he does in South of this problem, which is enormous. You go to any mental hospital in this country, you will find that the people in it are marijuana users on an amazing proportion.
But let me ask you a quick question, because we're almost out of time, Peter. But I mean, this may be something we look at again because we need a bit more time to talk about it. But in America, where so many states now have legalized marijuana and the sale of it, most of them now I think have. There's very few that haven't.
Well, in various ways they have. Some more totally than others.
Yes, but is there any evidence, as far as you are aware, that their crime rates have gone up as a result of legalizing it?
Well, not in this kind of instant way, because generally when you get legalization, it's preceded by a long period of lax enforcement of the kind that we've had here. So, for instance, enforcement of the marijuana laws in this country gradually ceased after 1971 and became almost non-existent by the turn of the century. So if marijuana were legalized in this country tomorrow, you wouldn't get a huge jump in these things because it already happened. So you won't get that. I'll tell you what evidence there is, and that is one of the classic arguments of the legalizers. Oh, well, if you legalize it and you take the trade out of the hands of criminal gangs, this has been proved now totally to be false. What's happened in Canada, which legalized, and in Colorado and other American states, is the criminal gangs have continued to exist because immediately the stuff is legal, it's taxed. And attempts are made to regulate its strength, and a lot of people don't want to pay the tax, and they don't want to have the strength of legislators, so they continue to buy from the gangs. So that claim has been proven to be false, and every time you hear anybody make it, blow them a raspberry, because it is proven rubbish. So that's one thing we have gleaned.
Well, I actually personally know a guy who used to run a vineyard in California who now grows marijuana, and he says it's far more profitable. He doesn't mind paying the tax, and he's very happy doing it.
Yeah, but he's in competition with people who are undercutting his prices all the time.
Yeah.
In the
yeah, but he's making so much. But he's making so much money, he doesn't care.
But the other ludicrous thing, we're constantly told there's strict prohibition against drugs in this country. Well, the figures came out today showing that in several areas of this country, drug driving, mainly marijuana, occasionally cocaine, is more common than drink driving.
I'm sure it is.
How can that be so?
Well, there was a time, you might have seen this story, but we have to go because unfortunately we're running late and I'm getting the eyes from next door telling me that I have to stop talking to you. But Peter, good to talk to you. Thank you very much indeed. What I would say is that there was a report, I seem to remember, back in the depths of the lockdown last year, where they said you could actually get cocaine delivered faster than a pizza. You know, and that's where we are in this country. So the idea that we say but drugs are prohibitive, nobody can get them, what a load of rubbish. Absolute cobblers. 0344 499 1000. Time for some news headlines.